Good afternoon, everyone. We are almost there. Wonderful closing keynote is waiting for us before, according to the program, a 4-hour cocktail reception. I'm looking forward to see everyone after a 4-hour cocktail reception. Our closing keynote is welcoming someone very special. Is a record-breaking disabled adventurer. And this means a lot to me. And just to share a bit of my personal story, I am a father of a 10-year-old boy who has a physical disability due to a neuromuscular condition that prevents him to jump, run, and walk at space. And as a father, while I was initially heartbroken to have to adjust my expectation of father and son relationships, not being able to ski together, play football, play tennis, he has, my son at 10 years old, made daddy proud in a lot of ways, going well beyond all my expectations, from getting into a very academic schools, which had to renovate their buildings to welcome wheelchair users, to be selected in the national team of wheelchair tennis for England, and playing his first ITF tennis tournament in wheelchair at 10 years old, 3 years before the legal age to play a wheelchair tennis tournament. Together, we've been sit skiing and paragliding. We've been diving with sharks in the Red Sea and riding elephants in Thailand. So the message here is whenever shit happens, excuse my French, there is always a silver lining and an opportunity to find grit and find purpose and fun and success. So for closing keynote, please join me to welcome our fantastic keynote speaker, someone who has reinvented the concept of disability as this ability to accomplish extraordinary things, completing 7 marathons in 7 days across 7 continents being one of them. This is Strength Through Adversity by Darren Edwards. Darren, the floor is yours.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. The first thing I need to say is I think that your son should probably be here instead of me. But as you know from personal experience, and I found out from personal experience the last 7 years, for me, those 3 words, strength through adversity, are kind of testament to the fact that it isn't adversity that defines what we're able to achieve. It's ultimately the accountability that we take and the ownership we take for the shit that goes wrong in life. Because everybody in this room will go through challenge and adversity in different forms at different times. And it's not about what we go through, it's about how we stand. A paraplegic telling you it's about how you stand up and take yourself. You know what I mean. But yeah, it's a real honor, thank you, to do this closing keynote for you. And yeah, in a break from tradition today, probably technology, you've just heard it for the first and last time for the next 20 minutes. But for me, I guess I need to sort of paint a picture of the person that I was and in terms of the direction I wanted to go in my life. So there were 2 things that really defined who I was as a person. And if you asked what constituted Darren Edwards in 2016, he would have said probably a love for mountaineering and for climbing that had taken him all around the world. And it was such a core part of how I'd built kind of like, self-belief as a teenager. I was someone that wasn't very academic. I never excelled at sport. But in climbing and mountaineering, I found a passion through which I could kind of express myself and slowly build my own self-confidence up in a completely different way outside of a school setting. And when I was a little bit older, I joined the Army Reserve, and after a couple of years of doing that, I'd put myself forward for selection to the Special Forces Reserve. So the SAS has a reserve unit attached to it. I probably don't really need to go into that for you to imagine that it's pretty grim, and they're looking for people that are able to put their head down and push beyond pain, push themselves out of their comfort zone and kind of stay there until they say you can stop. And that's probably the best way of describing that process. So for me, from a military perspective and from a mountaineering perspective, I was due to fly out to the Himalayas in 2018 to climb my first 8,000-meter mountain. So life has kind of headed in a really good direction. And I felt like for the first time in a long time, some of these dreams I'd held for a number of years were kind of within my grasp. And then life, unsurprisingly, there's a giveaway on the stage, isn't there? Life changed. So for me, I spent most of my free time in the mountains. So I live up near North Wales in Shropshire. So on my doorstep are the Snowdonia National Mountains. And a lot of my friendships, particularly my friendship with my best friend, a guy called Matt, had been forged through mountaineering and through climbing. So any spare time we'd spent in the mountains, testing our limits and pushing ourselves to climb harder stuff and to climb higher stuff, as is the way. And yeah, the 6th of August 2016 would ultimately be a day that wasn't like any other, because it would be the day that categorically changed my life and pushed me from that one very clear path to an unknown, daunting, and at the time, scary path. So we were, like I say, about an hour from where I live, and there's a rock face, which is about 180 foot tall, limestone vertical rock face. And in terms of setting the scene, the fact that it's called World's End works quite well. It is called World's End Rock Face. And with lead climbing, there are probably some climbers in the room, but with lead climbing, as you're ascending the rock face, you're putting your protective gear into the rock, you're clipping your rope through, and you continue to ascend. And essentially, you're protecting yourself if you're going to fall. That top bit holds you, and you only fall a certain distance and not the whole way. That is if that top bit of equipment does hold. So me and Matt have spent 3 to 4 hours climbing World's End. He's going out on a first Tinder date that night. So he's kind of like, let's wrap this up, let's go home. And I begged Matt for one final climb. So we were 3/4 of the way up. There was a final 35-foot pitch to the top of World's End. And we could have walked off the ledge. So the left-hand side picture is coincidentally the last one of me as I start that climb. So the last image, not that I knew it at the time, of me in that chapter of my life. And I said to Matt, look, it'll be quick. I'll get it done, and we'll be off, and you can go home, shower, shave, on your date. And I say, right, I'll lead it. So I lead this final 35-foot section, and it's probably at the limit of what I could comfortably, uncomfortably climb. But I got to the top. And it was only once I was at the top and I was preparing to belay Matt up to me, and then where we were going to finish off together. And it was as I took one final kind of cursory look over my left shoulder, and as I slightly leant and my weight went onto my left foot, that the section of rock that I'd decided to stand on, unbeknownst to me, was a weak point in the rock face. So a section about 4 foot wide and 2 foot deep broke off the top of World's End and dropped by a matter of feet and tilted. And it cracked, dropped, and tilted in such sort of quick succession that before I knew it, I'd been thrown from the top of World's End with 180 foot below me. And obviously we hear about fight and flight, and there's the third F. There's probably 2 more Fs, actually, if you think about it. But the F I'm referring to is freeze. And in that moment of being completely taken by surprise, I froze. And in the millisecond where I could have grabbed a live end of the rope and perhaps averted what was about to happen, I didn't, and I could feel that rope run through my hands, and by the time I could react, it was too late. And in those next sort of 3 to 4 seconds of falling, which to me felt like, 20, 30 minutes, for the first time in my life, with crystal clarity, I kind of didn't have a life flashing before my eyes type moment, but it was a life put into perspective moment. All of the things that, in a list format, I was about to never see again. Relationships with family, relationship with friends, my dog, all these kind of big things that come to your mind in terms of I'm never going to see this again. But what I don't know is that as I've fallen, and as that rock has fallen off the top of World's End, the rock has landed to the left of Matt, about 6 foot to his left, and it's alerted him to something happening. And he looks up and sees his best friend falling through the air. And in that split-second reaction time, what do? He unclips from the rock face, which is tying him in. And as I land on this tiny little ledge, no more than 6 foot wide, I land on my back and I start to tumble. And I'm about to tumble off that ledge. And I would have fallen another 140 foot. And in that moment, Matt, without hesitation, sprinted towards his best friend and lunged and grabbed hold of my harness as I was already halfway off that ledge. So I was 75 kilos. And in that moment, my best friend, without hesitation, lunged at a 75-kilo weight that was moving with momentum. So it took me a couple of months to realize what he'd done. He'd not only saved my life, he'd risked his own life as well, because I could have pulled him off with me. And in the seconds that followed, I knew that I was pretty badly injured. The first thing I tried to do was to almost laugh it off and stand up and kind of go, holy shit, can't believe I just survived that. And nothing was really registering. I couldn't move my feet, I couldn't move my legs. And ultimately, we were on that rock face for 3 hours while we waited for mountain rescue and while we waited for the Coast Guard to hover above that cliff face and make a plan for how we extracted me from this situation. And the picture on the far right turned up on Twitter the day of my accident. Unsurprisingly, I didn't see it. I was a little bit preoccupied, but I did see it 2 weeks later when a friend came in and said, look, I didn't want to show you this too soon, and it really hit home for me. I knew how lucky I'd been. I knew how lucky I was to get to see those people that I referred to before. But when I saw that image and you see the kind of tiny red dots of the mountain rescue team, and you get a sense of perspective in terms of had Matt not grabbed me when he did, how much further I would have fallen, I certainly wouldn't be speaking at EdTechX in London. I wouldn't be here at all. But for me, the most important part of this journey isn't the accident itself, it's not the injury itself, and I didn't know how I'd been injured at that point. I knew I couldn't feel my legs and move my legs, but I didn't know what had happened. It was a very simple promise, but it was a very difficult promise to make all at the same time. So in that moment, I was scared. I didn't feel very resilient. I didn't feel very brave. I didn't feel very courageous. I felt the opposite of all of those things. But I knew that if I was to get myself through this somehow, it would have to start with me taking accountability for what was going to happen. So admittedly, I was high as a kite on morphine at this point, but we put that to one side. I promised myself that whatever happened, just don't let it beat you. And I remember phrasing it, whatever this is, because I didn't know that I'd sustained a spinal injury, but it was that whatever this is, just don't let it beat you. And ultimately that day, being flown from World's End to intensive care, would start what would be a 5-month journey through initially intensive care, going through surgery, coming around the next morning to be told that I'd severed my spinal cord at chest level and I'd be paralyzed from the chest down for the rest of my life. And I always remember the surgeon's advice, because what I really wanted was a carrot at the end of the stick, to be told that if you work hard enough, you'll get back to the guy that you were. You'll get back to being in the mountains before you know it. But what he told me was that, look, categorically, you've severed your spinal cord, so my advice to you right here is to come to terms with it, to learn to accept that life's going to look a little bit different moving forward, and to focus on creating a new life for yourself and not focus on trying to get back to the guy you used to be. That was hard to hear because I wanted to be the guy I used to be. I wanted just to get back as soon as I could. But ultimately, his advice really set me on a path that did get me thinking about the future. And as I went through what would ultimately be a 5-month rehab process, where initially you start by doing 6 weeks of bed rest, which is as boring as it sounds, 6 weeks lying flat on your back in bed. But then week by week, step by step, no pun intended, you start to take control back and you start to take more accountability back for your life. Because ultimately you know that one day, and I certainly knew, I wanted to leave hospital and to start writing that next chapter. I wanted to follow in the surgeon's advice and start creating a future for myself that was one worth talking about and one worth living, and not one where I just kind of existed and just went through the motions. So as I came towards the end of my rehab, I remember asking the lady on the right-hand side image, my physio Kate, for a day away from hospital. And I didn't tell her why. I just said, look, it's something I need to do. It's a really important thing to me. And she said, are you going to be accompanied by anybody? And I was like, Matt. And when they heard Matt's name, I think they thought it was going to be something dangerous. I was like, it's nothing dangerous, I promise. But what me and Matt did do was drive 2 hours from where I was going through my rehab, and we drove 2 hours north to Manchester. And we went through the double doors of Manchester's canoe and kayak store, and about an hour later, we were leaving with 2 sea kayaks strapped to the roof of his car. I'd bought a sea kayak, a paddle, a buoyancy aid, all of the gear to go with it, absolutely no idea what half of it was. And I pretty much spent every penny that I'd saved from being in hospital for 5 months on a sport that I'd never done before. So I'd never kayaked in my life, didn't do anything like D&V, and I had no proof that somebody with a high-level spinal cord injury could learn to kayak. So I triumphantly rocked back up at hospital with that strapped to the roof of the car. And I went straight up to Kate and said, can you come outside with me? And I didn't expect her reaction. I thought she was going to be positively overwhelmed. She wasn't. She almost shrieked when I pointed to the car. And she looked at me and said, please tell me that's not yours. And I was like, yes, it is. And then I said, do you know anybody that has learnt to kayak after their injury? And she just went, no. But undeterred, I was discharged on the 23rd of December. On the 24th of December, so Christmas Eve, the very next day, my friends have booked the local swimming pool for 2 hours, and it was my opportunity to start writing that next chapter and to start discovering, like your son is doing, all of the things that are still out there that you can do. Maybe with a bit of an imagination, a bit of an adapt and overcome mindset, you can still do these things. Safe to say, That day in the pool didn't quite go to plan. I spent more time in the water and upside down than I did the right way up. By the time we got to the middle of a swimming pool smaller than this room, I'd fallen in 27 times. And if you look carefully, I'm just holding onto Matt's paddle. But for me, it was the start of that next chapter. And it was, me following that direction that I knew what it was that I wanted to be doing. And for me, those 6 weeks of my first bit of rehab, the Paralympics were on TV. And I'd watched the Paralympics for the first time in a whole new light because it was like flicking through an Argos catalogue of all the things that you could still go on to do. And they were living proof and testament to the fact that injury or disability doesn't stop you from performing at the highest level. And the sport that had really connected with me was kayaking because they got out of their wheelchairs, into their kayak, drifted off, and for all intents and purposes, they looked normal, which is kind of, I guess, what I was striving to look like and be like. But I also knew that this was something I could do with my friends by my side, and it would be like life had never changed. Maybe it would look different, but it never changed. So this picture's taken 3 months after that very first day in a swimming pool, and I've rocked up at the National Water Sports Centre in Nottingham, where the Paralympic kayaking team train, because I'd seen a flyer which was, "Are you the next big thing?" Words to that effect, maybe not a direct quote, but they were looking for the next generation of Paralympic athletes. And I arrogantly, having spent more time capsizing than being stable, thought, they're talking to me. So I turned up 3 months later on a very cold March morning, and the guy that took the picture was the head coach, a guy called Steve Train, Olympic medalist. And I think he was excited that he had someone young and motivated and, dedicated to making it happen. And he said, "Darren, when you're ready, if you just drift off and then do a couple of sprints for me, because it's a 200-meter sprint sport, and we'll take it from there." And I was like, brilliant, pushed off, and within about 6 inches, I could feel that this kayak was completely different to my sea kayak designed to be stable. This was designed to be fast, not conducive with stability. So I would love to lie, but I didn't even make it off the end of the left screen before I was upside down. And I remember the look of disappointment on Steve's face as I kind of came up through the water, and he kind of went, "Right," and he was a bit dumbstruck, and kind of went, "Well, if you want to get out, go get showered because it's cold, and you can go home." And I remember thinking, "Sorry, Steve, do you mind if I try one more time? I'll promise, second time will be better." So he kind of agrees, gets me out, tips the water out of the kayak. I push off again. Second time, I probably make it just off screen, and then fall in, and Steve repeats the same offer, and I was like, "Third time?" So he's like, "Okay, third time." Anyway, 2 hours later, I'm pretty much hypothermic, and I'm starting to visibly shake. I've fallen in 12 times, which I later found out was a record for anybody rocking up thinking that they had what it took. But ultimately, he changed his offer from shower, changed home, to shower, change, meet me in my office. And about 20 minutes later, sat in his office, clutching a cup of tea, and he said, "Look, I'm going to be completely honest with you. What I didn't see was natural talent." I'd kind of come to the conclusion myself. And he said, "But what I did see was somebody who was determined, somebody who had grit, and somebody who was willing to push beyond frustration and failure to get to where they wanted to be. And it's that we really find hard to find, the physical stuff we can build. So we'd like to invite you back." So for the first time in my life, somebody had said to me, it's not all about natural talent or smarts or fitness. It's about your mindset and your work ethic. So from the guy that couldn't stay the right way up, 6 months later, my job title officially became para-athlete, which was hilarious to me anyway. And I started to race at the national championships, British championships, and competing with some competition in Europe. I was initially the guy that couldn't finish a 200-meter sprint the right way up. So it became like a bit of a calling card that 150 meters in, I'd be upside down. But with determination and grit, I would start to then finish a race, which was a massive improvement. And then come fifth, then fourth, then third, then second. And everything was building up towards you had to be number one. So there was only one space for each country in the Paralympic Games in Tokyo. So it was be first or be at home became the kind of thing around camp. So for me, everything was moving in a really good direction. That gap was slowly but surely closing on the guy number one. But life doesn't always go according to plan, as we all know. And for me, a couple of weeks before that race season that would decide who would go to Tokyo and who didn't happened, I was in the gym and I tore my left shoulder. And I would go on to ultimately watch all of those races that season from YouTube Live at home licking my wounds, feeling a bit sorry for myself, and feeling a bit like a failure. Boris isn't there to represent failure. He's there to represent COVID. It's convenient. He's done me a favor there. It both talks about failure. Won't get political. Anyway, so for me, I had to really sort of sit and reflect on what I'd been building myself up for the last 3 years, and that hard work and determination. And I didn't want to let all of that just go to waste. I didn't want to stop this kind of like forward momentum that surgeon had always spoken about. Write the future, don't try and recreate the past. So I set myself a challenge that ultimately would be the challenge that has changed my life. And I was on Google Maps one day and did what probably many men do and just zoomed out a little bit and thought, I wonder how far it is from here to here. And came up with this concept of Land's End to John O'Groats by sea by kayak. It had never been done before, and I knew from a very quick, rudimentary Google map that it would be about 1,400 kilometers. I reckon it would take about a month, and ultimately it could be a charity fundraiser. I had no idea that ultimately what we were about to take on was some of Europe's most dangerous coastal waters. That came later in terms of a realization, but probably good because we maybe wouldn't have set off in the first place. And I had exactly the people in mind that I wanted to do this with. Now, the 4 people that are stood to my left share one thing in common, and that is that they've each been through that moment of adversity in their lives where, like me, they've been shunted from one path to another, but they'd created that second path for themselves and made it worth living. So Ben, who stood next to me, was shot 7 times in operations with the British military, very lucky to survive. Johnny, with the sunglasses on, was an army officer, ultramarathon runner, and one day had a brain bleed and was paralyzed down the left side of his body and went from somebody that was capable of running a 72-mile trail marathon to someone that couldn't take one step in front of the other. And it took Johnny 7 years to learn to walk again, and conveniently, he threw a bit of kayaking in there as well. And far right, Luke was injured in Afghanistan in 2010, stood on an ID, and lost a chunk of his lower right leg. So what you're looking at, in effect, are 5 people without anywhere near the standard or ability that they should have to be taking on the challenge that they're about to. But you've got 5 people there that have got that strength through adversity mindset and that adapt, improvise, overcome mindset. We knew that we weren't as good as we maybe had to be. And the night before we started, we sat down with the most experienced sea kayaker in the UK, who talked us through all of these places. Some might sound familiar. And there was one reason for that. And he just blow by blow went through it like this. And in quite detail as well. It was quite unnerving. But he ended that morale-boosting PowerPoint presentation with, but I think you've got a shot, so good luck. And undeterred, or slightly undeterred, the next morning we set off from the coast of southwest Cornwall, and we got off of the Rib that would be our safety boat for the next month, and 5 kilometers offshore from Land's End, which is the lighthouse in the background that you just see, we started what would be the most sort of epic adventure of our respective lives, and also would test the limits of our injuries and our disabilities in completely different ways. And for me, seeing as it was my idea, I became the sort of de facto expedition leader. I realized very quickly that it was really going to test. It wouldn't be me if it didn't involve a capsize. What hadn't helped in terms of my confidence was that happened 15 minutes in. So 15 minutes in, and here's expedition leader Darren thinking that being a leader is all about being at the front, being the best, being the strongest, being the quickest. And I felt like the complete opposite of all of those 5 descriptions. And I think what I came to terms with in that moment was that, you know what, even if I fall in every 15 minutes, the way that you're going to show leadership is you're going to get back out of that water, get back into that boat, and you're going to carry on. And if it happens in 15 minutes, you just do the bloody same thing. And that kind of was what I did. And there was a moment there where I thought maybe if I'm falling in this quickly, it's a sign that this is never, ever going to work. But, essentially we were out at sea for 12 hours a day, paddling 50, 60, 70 kilometers through some of the most dangerous coastal waters that we have in the UK. This video starts at Mort Point. Does anybody speak French? Well, Benjamin, Mort means what? Mort, the French word. Death. So it's called Death Point. That was great to realize as we were going through it. But I think what this video really captures is that day by day, as we pushed our expedition marker further and further up the coast of southwest England, pushing into northwest England, We grew in confidence individually and as a team. And for me, with every day that passed, I realized that I was far more capable than I'd given myself credit for the day before. But without doubt and without hesitation, I would finish every day and think, well, that's the best you're going to be. And somehow the next day, as we pushed our way further by another 60 or 70 kilometers, I would be a bit calmer, a bit more composed, a bit more stable. And it was just this progression. And as we're entering northwest England and now pushing through into the southwest sort of locks of Scotland, we're approaching, for me, what is a really important marker in my journey and sort of really poignant moment on this day. And this day was the 5-year anniversary of my accident. So 5 years after that rock had dislodged at the top of World's End, and 5 years after I was kind of sat on that cliff or laying on that cliff wondering what on earth life was going to look like, we're 20 days into this epic adventure. I've got 4 of my closest friends by my side, just like I always used to. We're, testing ourselves in ways that we couldn't have quite imagined. And had you told the guy that was in hospital, brokenhearted, and slightly scared for the future, that in 5 years' time he would be on his way to achieving the greatest thing in his life, let alone post-injury or pre-injury, just altogether, I'm not really sure I would have believed you. I'd have bitten your hand off for it to be true, don't get me wrong, but I don't think I would have believed it. And what I used to love about mountaineering was that you were a very small thing on a very big thing. And when you see the drone footage as we're approaching Fort William, you just see the kayak in the sort of left third. And it's such a small thing, such a big, natural, outdoor space. And that was all the ingredients that I once needed to be happy, and I still had them. So 26 days after we set off, 9 days ahead of what was clearly poor planning on my part, the 5 of us rocked up in John O'Groats. And in a overcast, soggy Scottish car park, I had that moment stood at the top of the world's highest mountain, and that's what it felt like to me. And if anything, that moment with those 4 stood next to me, with a bewildered audience of people that were there just to get a picture with a signpost. And when they asked us where we'd come from, we said Cornwall, they laughed and went, no, really, where have you come from? We're like, Cornwall. This was the kind of crowning achievement of my life. And it was a moment where I think I really realized for the first time that life post-injury, life with a disability or life with a spinal cord injury, however you want to capture that, isn't limited by your body. It's limited by your mindset and your approach to things and your willingness just to adapt the way you do things and find a way of getting the same response, the same emotional response that you want in a different way. And just to finish, I've come back very recently from doing this. So it was referred to in a phone call to me as the World Marathon Challenge. And the guy that was on the phone to me organizes this event, which has been run for 10 years. And 180 people have done this in history, and never by somebody with a disability. And he said, hi, Darren, I'm Richard, and I'm interested whether you would be interested in doing the World Marathon Challenge. Now, the name got me. I had no idea what it was, but I was like, World Marathon Challenge sounds cool. So I said yes. And he went, brilliant, do you know what it is? And I went, no. And that's when he explained to me that it's 7 marathons in 7 consecutive days over the 7 continents. So you're traveling 186 miles in 168 hours. You're traveling across the world, 18 time zones. And he said that he wants somebody with a disability to give it a go, to show that it can be done, and to open it up to a whole new audience, a whole new perspective, people that might want to give it a go. And he was like, are you in? And I was like, yeah, sign me up. When is it? It was in 11 months' time. And I went, brilliant. And he said, one last question. What's your current marathon PB? And I hesitated, because I'd never done a bloody marathon. And I thought, could I lie convincingly? And I realized I can't. So I kind of went with the honesty, and I said, look, Richard, I've never done a marathon. And a bit like Steve, that day in Nottingham, he almost like rescinded the offer and kind of went, go home. And I was like, look, I've got 11 months, right? And he was like, yeah. I was like, leave it with me. So this is the most overambitious they've ever been in my life, but those 11 months went really quickly, it turns out. And before I realized or could appreciate it, we were landing in northern Antarctica at a scientific research base called Camp Novo. It was minus 27. The wind speed was predicted to build to 60 miles an hour in the next few hours. And because there was no one that had really done the blueprint for this, we had no idea whether it was going to work or not. One thing I did know was that this wheelchair would probably fall apart within seconds. So a German company manufactured what is essentially the love child of a mountain bike and a wheelchair, And I got off that plane and hoped to hell that it would just work. I had no idea whether it would hit a patch of snow and stop, which it did on numerous occasions. As the wind built to 60 miles an hour, when you were with the wind, I absolutely flew. There were 18 other people doing it that were running, ranging from Red Bull athletes all the way through to an 80-year-old Texan cowboy who's a legend. And I rolled across the finish line in 5 hours and 50 minutes. That picture was taken with the wind. I'm smiling. And this is when we finished, 5 hours, 50 minutes in. I had completely forgotten that I'd signed up to do 7 marathons in 7 days. No word of a lie. I celebrated like I'd just done it. And the guy said, brilliant, well, when you're ready, just get onto the plane, because we've got 12 hours until Cape Town's marathon. And then I was like, oh, shit. And 12 hours came and went very quickly, and we'd gone from minus 27 to plus 30, going up and down the Cape Town boardwalk. From the moment we started, 12 hours later, we were then on a plane to Perth, Western Australia. I remember all of these marathons for different things. This Perth sunset, whatever time you landed, you started. You got off the plane and you went. And we landed as the sun was dropping, and we had this gorgeous sunset. And 14 hours later, you've guessed it, we were already somewhere else. And we were in Dubai for the Asia leg. And I remember Dubai for this kid who came up to us all at the start line and pointed to himself and said, Mohammed, and pointed to me. And I was like, Darren. And he said, OK, Darren, you win. And I was like, thanks, Mohammed. What I didn't realize was that Mohammed was going to follow me. Does anybody realize that the battery length of an e-scooter is 26 bloody miles? I didn't. So Mohammed followed me. 10 minutes in, I thought, well, he's going to have to recharge at some point, so I'll be OK then. But he repeated for 3 hours, OK, Darren, you win. OK, Darren, you win. And you know what? He really distracted me from the fatigue and exhaustion and everything else that I should have been feeling. So Dubai, I dedicate to Mohammed. Thank you very much, my friend. Madrid was the worst one by far. We were meant to be doing it around an F1 circuit. The F1 circuit called up a day earlier and said, we've double booked. So we found you an alternative place. That alternative place was a Madrid suburb that closed the roads for us, but it was a 1-mile loop. So 26 loops. The best part of Madrid was finishing the thing. We were then, for the longest flight over to Brazil, to Fortaleza, just outside the Amazon rainforest. For me, this picture perfectly captures that day. It was 40 degrees, really humid. I was just a hot, sweaty mess and just running on fumes. But 7 days later, at what was 3 a.m. local time in Miami, so the only people that were out at this point were 19 crazy runners and then loads of drunk Americans, which was brilliant, crossed the finish line of what was undoubtedly, the toughest challenge, both physical and mental, of my life, but also testament to the fact that sometimes in life you've got to take a punt on yourself, and you've got to be willing to gamble on your ability to do something and be happy with the fact you may succeed or you may fail, whether that's in your personal lives or in your professional lives. So for me, what started nearly 7 years ago now, on the 6th of August, has been the most incredible journey that I wouldn't trade for the world. And like your son, there are so many positive things for the future, and the world is really your oyster, regardless of what challenges we all face. So thank you very much. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Darren. I don't know whether you can talk about it or not, but you have a new challenge. Can you talk about it, or you want to keep it for? Yeah, okay, please do.
So if you thought that was crazy, on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say that's a 5. Next year, I'm leading an expedition to the South Pole, and I'm really excited about this because Matt is going to be part of the team. So the first time, and we're still best friends. We've been through one hell of a journey together, but he's in the military and he hasn't been able to be on any of these things. And our dream, once upon a time, was always to go to the South Pole together, and we're going to do it. So.
And Darren is doing those talks, and obviously to sometimes raise money for his expeditions. And just to give you a scale of what's needed to go to the South Pole, it's what, 300K. He got already 100K from British Airways.
Yeah.
100K from Canada Goose, and then 100K from someone else, and we don't know, we still have to find it. So if there is anyone here who is willing to support a good cause, that would be fantastic. Obviously, connect with us or with Darren directly. And Darren, I wanted to thank you.
My pleasure.
We have a tradition here at EdTechX, is the biggest award you can receive from us is what we call the X Award, which is a no award. You just have to take a picture with me.
Okay. All right. hold on. Hold on. Right. I feel like I'm sweating like I've done a marathon here. I like this award. Thank you.
Here we go.
Congratulations.
Thank you, buddy. Cheers.